What's the big rush? You don't need any drugs. Just plan an extra week on your trip and take time to acclimatize, and you'll be very comfortable and you won't get sick. And
Today's guest is a true legend in both the world of high-altitude medicine and mountaineering. Dr. Peter Hackett is a board-certified emergency physician, a pioneering researcher, and someone whose work has shaped how we understand and treat the effects of high altitude on the human body. Peter was part of the American Medical Research Expedition to Everest in 1981 and became the 111th person, is that correct, Peter? 111th?
That's right.
Person to summit Everest solo from the South Col, no less. And over the past 4 decades, Peter has dedicated his career to studying altitude illness and human performance in extreme environments. He has published over 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals and founded the Institute for Altitude Medicine based in Telluride, Colorado. Peter has treated climbers on Denali, on Everest, on Aconcagua, and when he's not away on an expedition, he may be found backstage at a Rolling Stones concert serving as the band's tour doctor. From the summit of Everest to the front row of rock and roll, Peter has probably seen it all. And you may not remember this, Peter, but you were the lead instructor on the first wilderness first responder course I took. I think it was 1991 in Yosemite Valley. AMGA organized the course, and learning from you from the first time about high altitude was a dream for me as a young 20-year-old mountain guide at that time, aspiring mountain guide. So welcome to the show, Peter. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
So today I want to talk about Xenon, a particular subject, and we're bringing you on obviously for your breadth of experience, but also you have this really unique perspective as a mountaineer, as a medical doctor, as a researcher, specifically around the effects of high altitude and high altitude illnesses. And one of the things I want to help people understand is just what Xenon is. So while I definitely want to hear a story about touring with the Stones, let's start from the top. What exactly is xenon gas, and how does it interact with the body on a physiological level? What do we know?
Yeah, good place to start. You know, xenon is one of the noble gases. It's a part of the atmosphere. It's a very rare atmospheric gas. About 1 in 10 million parts of the atmosphere is made up by xenon, as opposed to, the other noble gases are argon and krypton and helium, and are even more common than that. The noble gases are thought not to be chemically reactive. They're considered to be inert, which is interesting, but they do have physiological effects. So they seem to act on molecules, especially certain receptors in the body. And xenon, it was discovered in 1898. It was purified from liquefied air, and it was used initially as an anesthetic agent. It is still an anesthetic agent. It's used to provide anesthesia in Russia quite a bit. The Russians have quite a bit of experience with it. It was used in the U.S. in the 30s and 40s, and it's very similar to nitrous oxide. It has some similarities to ketamine. It has similarities to cyclopropane, which is a more common anesthetic. One of the main reasons it's not used as an anesthetic anymore is that it's so expensive. Much, much more expensive than any of the other anesthetic gases. But it's safe when it's used by an anesthesiologist, and it's effective as an anesthetic. And somewhere along the line, the Russians did some work and found that it stimulated EPO, and they were known to, it was an open secret that they were using it at the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014. And that's when it started to percolate into other circles as a possible blood doping agent or performance enhancing agent.
Mhm. Okay, interesting. So, do we know when you say it's like nitrous oxide? What does that mean? That it puts me to sleep if I breathe it?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Does
So
it
it acts
and it
on
numbs pain?
well, yeah, it puts you totally out.
Okay.
It acts on NMDA receptors of the brain, which is a little different than some of the other anesthetics, but it's the same
Oh,
receptors as nitric oxide and
okay.
similar to ketamine. So any of these agents, they're obviously dose related. And the Russians
Okay.
used it mainly. Did they give a high enough dose, like maybe 50% or 70% xenon gas in air or oxygen? It's enough to put you out for surgery for a long time. And then they
Okay.
take the gas away and you wake up. So
Okay.
the effect is fairly temporary. It stays in the body. You can find traces of it in the body for about 3 hours.
Okay. Interesting. And so the xenon oxygen mixture is administered through the whole surgery in the case of its use as a surgical anesthetic, and then it's just basically removed, and then the patient presumably just breathes like pure oxygen or normal air during recovery, and they
Exactly.
just wake up.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned EPO. What exactly is EPO for those of us that may not know what that term
Well,
refers to?
EPO is erythropoietin. It's the hormone made mostly by the kidney in response to low oxygen in the body, and it acts on the bone marrow and to produce more red blood cells, which is a process that takes a while. I mean, it starts in a couple hours, but you really don't get an appreciable increase in red blood cells that will help your anemia or improve your performance for weeks.
Mhm.
So, and as you well know, and as mountaineers and anybody in sports knows, synthetic EPO was developed for people with kidney disease who were anemic, and it's been used by athletes to increase the red blood cell count, or I like to say, increase their hemoglobin in order to improve performance. But here's a key point that a lot of mountaineers don't understand. Both blood doping, the infusion of blood, in preparation for a performance, or naturally injecting blood, or using the synthetic hormone, is only good at high altitude. It's only of benefit up to about 4,000 meters.
Why is that?
It's because after 4,000 meters, what's much more important than the amount of hemoglobin you have in your blood is the amount of oxygen that's loaded on that hemoglobin. And breathing is much more critical. Your blood oxygen level is much more critical than your hemoglobin level. And this has been shown experimentally and in the field. And, the Extreme Everest group that climbed Everest and did research after we did very nicely showed that at a certain point, the amount of hemoglobin isn't so important, and the amount of oxygen is. So it's a misperception that, if you use hypoxic tents, for example, to acclimatize, yes, you'll raise your hemoglobin level, and it'll definitely help on the way into base camp. But it's not going to help much above base camp. And what's more important is the other changes that take place with repeated hypoxic exposure, particularly the increase in breathing. And I think there's a big misunderstanding that it's the red cells that are all important. It's not.
Yeah.
In fact, you could probably climb Everest with moderate anemia and probably do okay as long as you had a high enough oxygen saturation level.
Yeah. Interesting. And I think a lot of the press around the use of xenon as a pre-acclimatization shortcut, acclimatization shortcut, has focused on its known, and maybe again, maybe I don't, maybe this isn't known, maybe I don't understand the physiology of xenon well enough. acting as a stimuli to the process. As you say, it's a 4 to 6 week process, right? From the stimuli to a mature red blood cell. And so that's obviously a very long time. But so it seems that if this is really working the way people have been saying that it's working for them in some individual cases, specifically with Lucas Fortenbach, and I'm going to have him on in a separate episode and explore that with him, that there must be something else going on. It's not just, it's the red blood cell is sort of a red herring. It feels like it's the red blood cell count isn't the thing.
Yeah.
There's got to be something else to do with the oxygen saturation of the existing blood. Like you just said, you could be mildly anemic and have low red blood cell count. And if your O2 sats were good, you would be okay. I mean, that's your supposition. So what else could be happening here with this gas?
Well, we could get into the weeds here.
Yeah, that's okay.
First of all, let's back up for just a minute and look at what we know about whether xenon actually increases EPO or not.
Okay.
And that's been shown in animals and humans that it does for a while.
Okay.
And that was established. The next thing to establish was, well, does this increase in EPO produce red blood cells and increase hemoglobin levels as synthetic EPO would, or as altitude training would, And so the study was funded by WADA because they became alarmed that the Russians were using xenon gas. They didn't know if it was safe. They heard that it increased EPO. Their WADA rules, that's the World Anti-Doping Association, has banned EPO and other synthetic forms of erythropoietin as performance enhancing. So WADA kind of off the cuff just banned xenon gas, but they did fund some research, and Justin Lawley and Ben Levine, colleagues of mine at University of Texas Southwest, they did a really nice study looking at daily xenon use and intermittent xenon use in athletes and looked at EPO levels. And yes, EPO went up. But in their 4-week study of using a dose of xenon every day, interestingly, there was no increase in hemoglobin or in exercise performance, which raises more questions than it does answers. So they concluded that, okay, you get a little bump in EPO for a little while, but it doesn't seem to make any difference in performance. But WADA banned it anyhow, is my understanding. So the question remains open. And with these studies, there's all sorts of, what dose of xenon are you going to use? How long are you going to use it? How many times a week or month or whatever? So, there's all sorts of permutations that haven't been studied. Mm-hmm. And so we get back to the question of, so I just had to put that as groundwork.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
The bottom line for you and for all climbers to know is that it's not well established that xenon actually raises red cells. Okay. It's not at all well established that it raises exercise performance. There was one study with an N of 1, and that was Lucas Fortenbach, and he studied it on himself. So, that's fascinating, and I congratulate him for thinking of it and doing it. But is that, are climbers going to adopt it based on that one experience with one person? I don't think so. We certainly wouldn't in any kind of medical practice, so it needs to be studied. Now, sorry, to get back to your other question, what else could it be doing? Well,
yeah,
there's a researcher by the name of Fries I think he's Austrian, who approached Fortenbach, and he had been studying xenon gas as a protective agent for the brain and other organs when circulation stops, so cardiac arrest or stroke or heart attack, anything where there is no blood flow to an organ. And, this is one of the holy grails of medicine, is to find an agent that can protect organs that are compromised by lack of blood flow, like in heart surgery, for example, or strokes, heart attack, et cetera. So he worked with animals, and he showed that indeed xenon was protective. If the animal had a dose of xenon, I forget, just prior to or just after the cardiac arrest or the cessation of blood flow, it helped preserve tissue. And other researchers have shown the same in other animal models.
Okay.
And that's really interesting. And that might turn into something to be used during heart surgeries where the heart is stopped and that sort of thing, or strokes. I don't know. But that's a long ways from protecting the brain from blood flow, but blood flow with low oxygen. They're not the same. And this is a common confusion in the medical literature as well as in various communities. Stopping all blood flow and having reduced oxygen, having no oxygen, is much different than having very low blood oxygen levels, but having some blood flow. And all sorts of studies show you can tolerate a very low oxygen level. I mean, look, you've been on the 1,000 meter peaks without oxygen. Your arterial PO2 was about 25 to 26. And humans aren't thought that they could survive at that level of what we call hypoxia. Yeah. So there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot to learn. Anyhow, he approached Furtenbach and said, I found that, this is my understanding, you should talk to Lucas, but it's my understanding that he showed him his studies, which looked really good and interesting for protecting tissues that were starved of oxygen. And he suggested, as I understand it, that Lucas try this on the mountain. And Lucas tried it and said, wow, it really made a difference. So we need to find out more about that. And it hopefully will lead to some really interesting research. It needs to be well-funded research because it's very expensive stuff. Yeah. And there's a couple of things that anybody consider or wanting to know more about this or considering needs to know. One is that it's potentially lethal, just like nitrous oxide or ketamine. If you give too much, you're going to kill yourself. It should be administered only by somebody who knows what they're doing, and preferably with an anesthesia machine with medical monitoring. And my understanding is that what Lucas is going to do with his clients from the UK. Mm-hmm. That's safe. That is safe. The original article that was published on the athletes came out, and I think the UIA statement came out and said, oh, this is really dangerous. And, well, yeah, if you were to just go online and buy a liter of Xenon and suck it in, God knows what's going to happen. So, we want to, there's no role for that, right?
Right.
I mean, that's potentially deadly. So you need an anesthesiologist or a skilled physician. You need a machine, you need the gas, and you need medical monitoring. Okay, that's probably the most important thing to get across. The second thing.
And it's probably not pure xenon, right? Because there needs to be, like you said, it's probably 70%, 78% xenon and 22% oxygen, or whatever it is. They're not going into full hypoxia, getting choked off.
That's right. Ben and those guys studied 30, 50, and 70% different dosages.
Okay.
And what they did was that the different dosages for breathing for 2 minutes, this is a good example. They had people had to pull a lever. That was the exercise that they had to do. And they would tell them, okay, 20 seconds after the gas started, to pull a lever, 30 seconds, pull a lever. And at like 60 seconds, nobody could pull a lever anymore, because they're unconscious or starting to go unconscious. So you don't want to, it's potent. It's a potent gas. So where were we? Oh, yeah. So if anybody's considering it, then the second important thing is that we really don't know.
Yeah.
Furtenbach tried it and had great results. Well, great. Well, one guy went over Niagara Falls in a barrel and survived too, and he had great results. You're going to try that?
Yeah.
It needs more work. I mean, I respect
Right.
Furtenbach. I think he's I really do. But
Yeah.
I'm sure he admits that, this ought to get some more research before it's applied. And then the third thing is you got to be careful of claims that this could be useful. And no diss on anybody, but if you're going to Everest and you're going to sleep in a hypoxic tent for 2 months before you go, so that you'll be acclimatized to the altitude of 4,000 or 5,000 meters anyhow, and you can get into base camp much more quickly. And then you start the climb and you go on high flow supplemental oxygen as low as 6,000 meters or 6,200 meters. And you go up and on oxygen the whole way, come down the whole way and helicopter back, and you're back in Kathmandu in a few days. Have you proven that Xenon had anything to do with it?
Yeah.
So that's why we like to do what we call controlled experiments, where you would study just the effect of Xenon. Because we know, I mean, I've been saying this for decades, and I think you've heard me say this.
Yeah.
What is it about Everest? It's the altitude. If Everest Base Camp were on the shores of Alaska, like in the Fairweather Range, the peak would be 3,500 meters tall. It's not even pretty. People wouldn't even want to go to it. And there'd be minimal difficulty. But if it were the highest peak in North America, thousands would climb it, right?
Right.
So it's an altitude problem, and the body needs time to acclimatize, and you're really pushing the extent of what humans can do with hypoxia. So if you take away the hypoxia, that is, you start on oxygen, you can fly into base camp, slap on the oxygen, go straight up to Camp 2 or the first day, or Camp 1 or 2, stay on oxygen, go straight up to the summit and come back down. You can do it all in 3 days if the weather's good, even faster if you're super fit. I've been saying that for decades. So what does that prove? So anyhow, with the hypoxic tent and the high flow oxygen at a relatively low altitude, you don't need anything else.
Yeah. And I'm smiling because I've said similar things that I think that I could, probably tomorrow, if I had a foolproof oxygen delivery system and I could breathe, the kits are so much better than they were in 1981. I mean, what you guys used back then compared to, how good those masks are now is incredible, right? And they're delivering, all the kinks have been worked out of that system, right? And if you deliver 6 or 8 liters a minute, what's the actual altitude, right? Like that could be the actual thing that's going on. So
we have
known risks.
By the way, we have new data that I'll share with you. I would like to share with you at some point about from a chamber study showing what the equivalent altitude is at various flows of oxygen at 8,000 to 8,800 meters.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'd be very, very interested to know what that is. You guys have. Can you tell us, or is this not published? Or
well, I don't want to blow it. It's not published yet, but I can tell you that 8,000 meters and above, 1 liter per minute is adequate for sleeping or at rest, and 2 to 3 liters is adequate for most climbing. You don't need 6 is a total waste. Even 4 is kind of a waste, but anyhow, that'll be coming out later.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to know when that comes out. We'll help you talk about it.
Yeah.
So just to kind of recap, because we've covered a lot of ground, we do know of sort of at least the short-term risks around using Xenon. Like you said, you could pass out and die if you didn't administer it properly. Do we know anything about the long-term effects of using Xenon in any capacity? No.
Not that I know of. I've never seen anything written about long-term effects.
Okay.
I don't think there would be any. It's considered safer than nitrous oxide. And I've never seen any long-term effects. I suppose there are, but I mean, there might be, but not from these brief intermittent inhalations. I don't think there'd be any.
Do you think that there is if you think about the potential around research with this gas, do you think that there's a potential valid medical use for xenon in treating altitude illness or and helping people climb in any way?
Well, certainly not in treating altitude illness. There's nothing that's going to be close to oxygen. That's really all you need. In terms of acclimatizing, I mean, that's what we're talking about. I think it ought to be studied. I think it deserves more investigation. That's my own feeling. And I know some of my colleagues say poo-poo, just, spend your money somewhere else. But I'm intrigued by Furtenbach's observation, and I think it needs to be followed up with some science. And as you have pointed out, the coaches and athletes are way ahead of the scientists when it comes to performance and these sorts of things. So we get our ideas from, like the Russians showed up with it at Sochi. So we got the idea, oh man, maybe we should study this.
Yeah, maybe this has an effect. They've already figured out what the effect is. And I think that's an important thing, because I think that there's a lot of people want to follow science, right? But also people need to understand that, I'll use the sports example, like coaches and athletes are, competing on a weekly, monthly basis over sometimes decades, over careers, and they're trying all kinds of stuff. And just through that sheer volume of trial and error, they're able to figure out, and testing it in competition, sort of what helps and what doesn't. And they know that things like good nutrition, lots of sleep, staying, there's certain things. It's like, if it helped to be sleep deprived to perform better, we would have found that out, and maybe all the athletes would be sleep deprived before every competition. And then we would come along later and do the studies and sort of figure out what's working. And I think that when, as a community in a case like this, we want to look to the science and we want to say, like, hey, does this work? Is this okay? And the reality is that this is the way it happens, that somebody gets an idea, they get an inkling that, whether it's from the Russians or whether it's the doctor, I forgot, the Austrian doctor, or maybe he's German, that you mentioned earlier, that did the studies on the animals. Mm-hmm. And then, like, hey, let's what about this? What about this application? Let's try it. And then maybe it works, and then we find out, okay, there's something here. Like clearly Lucas feels very strongly that he's onto something. He's betting his reputation, his business, his everything, his life on this. And and to your point, maybe it's only the effective delivery of actual oxygen. Maybe that's the secret ingredient. Maybe it has nothing to do with xenon at all. Maybe the xenon is smoke and mirrors, so to speak, to make it feel like he has something exclusive, unreproducible formula. But that's a very cynical view. I don't think that any of us feel like, Lucas is part of our community, and I don't think any of us feel like any of us are that cynical to try something like that. So there's I'm with you. I think that there's something to it. I think we don't know what it is. I think it's going to be years before we find out, but I think in our lifetimes we will find out. And I don't know if that is in 4 years or in 10 years, but it's not going to be next week.
No. It's not going to be in time for people listening to this podcast that want to use it to climb Everest, or maybe not. But it depends on their age. But I think I agree. It's very important to be open-minded. As scientists sometimes aren't as open-minded as you think they might be. And it's important to pick up on the things that are happening in the field and that are reported as even unique experiences. It's most important to make sure that it's not dangerous, and people aren't going to be, you don't want like a TikTok trend, right? Where all sorts of nonsense is going on that could be potentially harmful. So one thing nice about mountaineering is there is a very strong tradition of science in mountaineering. And all the initial mountaineers were scientists. They were going up there to study the atmosphere and barometric pressure and all that stuff. There's a long tradition, and sometimes that's how we stumble upon things. Other times it's just pure common sense, like oxygen. And other times we've discovered a drug works like Diamox that was based on an animal study, and really nobody, of course, was using it for that. But it varies.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example. Like Diamox, those who don't know, is probably if you go to your family physician and tell them that you're going to trek to Everest Base Camp, they're going to, if they don't know this already, they're going to look it up and they're going to come back and say, hey, we're going to give you a prescription for Diamox. Here's the dosage. Here's, it's a well understood and commonly prescribed medication to help people to prevent, you're the expert, I should let you say this, but to prevent acute mountain sickness or to minimize the symptoms. Yeah, and that came from, tell me the story of how that came. Maybe is there anything, and I'm curious if there are potential parallels to Diamox and how this may unfold.
That's a good question. And I should know that right off the top of my head. I first became aware of it from it had to do with this old controversy that dates back to the turn of the century in the early 1900s about whether acidifying the blood or alkalinizing the blood would be good for high altitude. And this was a big area of contention. And it turned out that there was some research on acidifying the blood, found it useful, but it was with ammonium chloride, which was horrible to eat, and it never gained any kind of popularity. And then in the 1960s, a guy by the name of Dunn studied it, said, maybe there's something to acidifying the blood because when you acidify the blood, you cause the organism to breathe more. And that's key to high altitude acclimatization. So he studied dogs, and sure enough, the dogs had higher oxygen levels. And I think that the first study was done in soldiers. And then in 69 or somewhere around then. And then 74, I came along and did the first study on Diamox in a large population of trekkers, 243 trekkers up at, near the Everest Base Camp. And Steve, that was 50 years ago. Yeah. 50 years ago. And we still haven't improved very much on agent. It works okay, but it's not a gold standard, and it does prevent serious mountain sickness, which is what you want. Everybody can get a little mountain sick and go on, but you don't want to get serious. Anyhow, I don't see Xenon for playing any kind of role in that, but who knows? I think it's more likely to be protective for acute severe hypoxia, like balloonists or something like that. But I don't know. More work needs to be done. In science, as you know, science is a very slow process. So trial and error, you got to reproduce results, like the study that showed that Xenon did not improve hemoglobin or improve performance. Well, it was a good study, but it's one study with 12 subjects, and it really ought to be repeated. Who's going to fund those kind of studies? I don't know. That's always an issue.
Yeah. So I'm curious to kind of just change the approach a little bit and understand that, in your view, where is the ethical line between supporting an adaptation that the body has to something like high altitude and pharmacologically engineering human performance?
Yeah, well, that's a big issue. As a doctor who's trying to keep people safe in the mountains, it's not much of an issue for me. I have my medical ethics, which is to prevent morbidity and mortality and keep people healthy. And I have moral issues, but I don't have much in the way of ethical issues around climbing. I mean, the ethics of climbing is determined by climbers. It's a kind of a consensus of a culture, opposed to moral issues. And climbing is generally non-competitive. People aren't out there now they are with FKTs and things. Well, they're generally out there to enjoy themselves, to enjoy the mountains, to have a great time. They're not competing. Who cares what WADA says? This is not a WADA sanctioned sport, and that you're not competing for money or goods or things. And so I don't have any qualms. I don't have any issue of, is it sporting or not? If somebody wants to go to Kilimanjaro, they got 2 weeks off. They can only do a 6-day trip, for example. Hell yes, they got to take Diamox. That's the only way it improves their safety and success rate dramatically. And same thing, if somebody's going to Everest, as a physician, I have to advise them to use oxygen. Well, I shouldn't say that. I have to present all the risks and benefits of using oxygen or not. Let them decide for themselves. But I don't understand a lot of this ethical stuff about, there can be a fine line between what supports adaptation. So that means acclimatization. What supports acclimatization? Adequate sleep, healthy lungs, for sure. That's the most important. Gradual ascent to high altitude. What about hypoxic tents? Is that an ethical thing? WADA looked at it and decided they would allow it, because why should the people that can go to an altitude training camp and come back have a big advantage over people that can't afford that but could use a tent? That was the rationale. And but then, it gets in a little murky territory, and they certainly banned EPO. But just because WADA banned something doesn't mean climbers should not use it. So I don't know. It's really not an issue of pharmacologically enhanced acclimatization. Acclimatization is what you want. Well, this is where it gets tricky. Your goal is acclimatization, unless you're going to climb with oxygen, and it doesn't matter. And anything that supports acclimatization, I think, is good. And does blood doping support acclimatization? Well, it supports your increase in red blood cells, but we know it's not nearly as good as living at high altitude and spending more time at high altitude. And if people have an issue with, they want to do something that's sporting, well, that means they're going to not use oxygen on their 7,000 or 8,000 meter peak. And they may use a sleeping pill to help them sleep, or they may use ibuprofen for a headache, but they're not going to use Diamox probably because that promotes acclimatization. But what I find interesting is there are all these people that are a lot of them who are spouting about, it's not sporting to use Diamox or dexamethasone, which we reserve for treatment, as generally speaking, are the same ones that are using oxygen. I mean, there's really only one drug that's been shown to reliably enhance performance at high altitude, and that's oxygen. And it has no side effects. It's safe. It is a drug. It's considered by the FDA a drug. And, if you're going to use oxygen, don't talk to me about sporting for anything else or dexamethasone or anything else. And of course, I advocate the use of oxygen because I think it's much, much safer. And of
course,
anyhow, it's a tricky conversation.
It's a very tricky conversation. And, I myself have been on the other side of that in the past, where I used to be very critical of people using oxygen or, any kind of, let's say, aid. And at the same time, I strongly believe in the mountains as being a place of freedom, where I can do what I want, where I'm going there on my terms. And then it's like what immediately begs the question is like, so what right do I have to dictate the terms to someone else? Right? Like the freedom of the hills, that's the classic phrase that we all have used and all come up with around this sport.
Yeah.
And I think that it really comes down to, declare your aids and just do it for yourself, right? Like if you're going to use all the things, use all the things, but don't say you did it without all the things when you really did. That's I think that's like less unclear, right? Now you're saying you did this climb without oxygen and without dexamethasone, without Diamox, without Xenon, but you actually did employ all those means, then that's a problem, right? And so as long as people are sort of saying, and I think that that's one of the things I respect with Lucas's approach, he is saying like, hey, we're going to go do this. We're going to try this thing. I've tested it on myself. We don't know, and he's declaring his aids, right? Like he's not saying, he's not just sort of hiding that. And then he climbs Everest in a week with 4 people and then everybody's scratching their heads like, how did you do that? He's explaining ahead of time how he's planning to do that. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. We're going to find out here in the next few weeks.
Well, we're not really though. If you were doing just Xenon and ran up Everest in a week, holy cow, we would know it's Xenon. But doing pre-acclimatization and oxygen on the mountain, and there's no way to know what Xenon's doing.
Yeah. And so they are doing those things. So
that's where the controlled experiment comes in as being valuable,
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground here. I think it's been really informative. And one of my goals with this is to really give people as much information as we have about this topic. My goal is not to make up anyone's mind for them or tell them how to think. It's just simply to provide information and let people make their own conclusions. And we've covered a lot of what we know. Is there anything that you know personally, professionally, as a researcher about not just Xenon, but specifically Xenon, but also these types of non-oxygen, let's call them, drugs that we should be aware of as a community, that we should be thinking of? We don't know really long-term effects. We know some short-term effects. We know it's expensive. Like there's some basic information out there. But what other things should we know?
Well, a couple of things. One you touched on earlier, and that is how to assess the state of the art in terms of the science and whatnot. And in the UIAA statement on Xenon came out pretty quickly, and it stated that there's no evidence that it's beneficial. And I think what people need to understand is that the absence of evidence does not mean that there's evidence of absence of effect. This is a phrase we use in science all the time. Yeah, it's not been shown to be helpful in the mountains. Why? Because it's never been studied in the mountains.
Yeah.
So
the chicken and the egg.
Yeah, I mean, so a clearer statement is no one has yet studied it in the mountains, so we don't know. Yeah. Which is the same as saying there's no evidence that it works, but it's a little more accurate. So that's one thing. And as a physician, I would advise my clients not to try it until we have some sort of science, and then we've figured out whether it can really work or not. That would be my own advice. I'm generally an early adapter of new technologies and new therapies, but this is a very powerful thing that costs a lot. That may not be worth it unless we can show it can actually be of some benefit. So it'd be helpful to do a controlled experiment. The second thing is, I got in high altitude medicine because I love being in the mountains. And there I was working for the Himalayan Rescue Association at 4,200 meters in Nepal. And oh my God, seeing all these people come by getting sick. I thought they all got the flu when they came to the Khumbu. I finally realized, wait a minute, this must be altitude sickness. That's how I started my career. Where was I going with that? It depends on people's motivation. If your motivation is going to the mountains in order to get away from technology in the world and find yourself and push your limits and meet Sherpas or other cultures and immerse yourself in other cultures, and what's the big rush? You don't need any drugs. Just plan an extra week on your trip and take time to acclimatize, and you'll be very comfortable and you won't get sick. And, it takes 7 to 10 days to start improving your exercise performance once you arrive at 3,500 or 4,000 meters. So it's take that much time.
Yeah.
But then there's other people who are motivated that, no, they got to do Everest. They got to punch their ticket and they've only got 2 weeks to do it. And so they're going to pay a fortune in order to try to, a totally different motivation.
Yeah. 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 And I think it's a slippery slope when we start evaluating or judging other people's motivations. There's things that I've done in my life that I'm sure, especially in climbing, that most people would not do. They would think that that's ridiculous, like not put their foot in my boot, and that's okay, right? And I think it goes the other way too.
Yeah, we don't want to be judgmental. On the other hand, we watch with some horror, if you want to use a strong word, at what's happening on the great peaks. And it's just not what it was 30, 40 years ago when we first started. Of course, you can say that about most things, but you have to learn to put up with that. And if you don't like the crowds, go do the northwest buttress of the Denali instead of the west buttress, or try a different route on Everest or different peak or something. Yeah. But anyhow.
Yeah. How has your own relationship with risk changed over your career? You climbed Everest in 1981, the 111th person to do so. Now it's, thousands. Sometimes it gets that many ascents on one day, right? So, how does that change over your life?
My assessment of risk?
Mm-hmm.
Well, with age, one gets more conservative and has other responsibilities and family responsibilities that I didn't have when I was 33 on Everest. And like you, I've seen a lot of my friends die, and it's certainly sobering. So, sure, the risk calculus changes as we age. And what I'm really into is managed risk, which is what I think all the climbers should be. In other words, I'm really looking objectively at the risks and being realistic, and then figuring out how to manage those, and then making a decision. Look at it last year on Denali. A couple of guys from Colorado. They were living in Colorado, so they were at medium altitude. They thought they were well enough acclimatized to go from the airstrip up to the 4,300 meter camp very quickly. So they did it in a day and a half. And the guy died of altitude illness. Now that was a risk that you could certainly foresee and easy to mitigate. You just put in 2 or 3 camps before you get to 4,300 meters, So, some of these risks are just based on ignorance, I guess. Assessment. It's an incorrect risk assessment,
Right. And that's one of the things I think with this Xenon topic that I want to bring more information to the topic, because I think there's a lot of misinformation and just a vacuum of knowledge around this topic. And what I don't want to see is someone saying, hey, I want to set an FKT on Mont Blanc. I heard Xenon is good. I get to get a hold of a bottle on the internet somewhere, and like what you said, and then they are found dead in their apartment in Chamonix the next morning because they didn't have all the tools, because they just thought this was a shortcut to high performance. And I think that's a real risk too in this, right? Like there's a lot, the hype cycle is pretty high on this topic right now. And there's a lot we don't know. And I think when you talk to Lucas, you find out that he's a very smart, but also a very calculating person. I mean, any mountain guide becomes an excellent manager of risks, especially when you're guiding in high risk environments like 8,000 meter peaks. But that is their approach is, while it's sort of, let's say, a trade secret, it's also very deliberate and careful how they're approaching this. They do have medical doctors, they do have the machine, they are doing it in a clinic or a hospital. I don't know, and they don't have to say. And I think that is really important context for people to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's keep it alive. And I have to see what happens. You might have somebody marketing a handheld Xenon gas device, in the next few months or something. God knows.
Yeah, right.
It can be really crazy out there. So I'm really glad that you're doing this podcast to tell people that there's a lot we don't know about Xenon, and it's very experimental, and hold off until we get a little more experience with it. And I think that's you're doing a great service.
Well, because of your help, thank you for that. So I've got to ask you about the touring with the Stones. Like I've heard some of these stories in the past, and first of all, just like, how did it come to be that Peter Hackett became the tour doctor for the Stones?
High altitude, they were touring in Mexico City. They were worried about the altitude, so they gave me a call. That was 2006 on the Bigger Bang tour. We hit it off, and then they decided they wanted a full-time doctor. And so I'm one of three doctors that rotate through with them. And I've been with them now for 20 years, going on 20 years. And it's a different kind of risk assessment. And they have a whole security team that protects them from the risks of all sorts of things. But it's it's really interesting, and it's been it's been fun. And it's not that much time. They don't even tour every year. They tour every couple of years, maybe for a few months. So it's not too bad. And I can't say much about it.
All right. Well, I expect a backstage pass in my future, Peter. That's all I have to say.
Oh, for sure. For sure. If they ever tour it again, yeah.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, that's maybe the more important thing is finding out when they're going to tour and where we could get tickets. I know that they were in Munich a couple of years ago. I don't know if you were at that show, but that was the last time they were. I heard that them were close to where I'm sitting here in Austria. So,
well, stay tuned.
Okay, I will.
Vienna has a lot of promise.
All right.
Okay.
Good. I'd love to get my boys, like Francie and Seppi. My kids are getting really into music, and my older one, who's 9, last weekend asked me if I'd ever heard of a band called Metallica. Because it's his new favorite band.
It's too much.
I'm like, I know a little bit about that. So they're going in a good direction. I think the Stones are a critical part of that education, though. It's all part of it.
Classics. Yeah. Classic.
Well, thanks so much for your time and your expertise and your opinions. And it's such an honor to have you on here and helping to share your wisdom and hard-earned knowledge with this community. So thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Dave. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. All right.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.